This is Pamela Smythe from the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on SoundCloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 148 of Beyond the Bulletin, originally broadcast on December 9th, 2022. An estimated 1,000 people are homeless across our region. Nearly half of those are experiencing chronic homelessness. In March, the University of Waterloo and the region of Waterloo called for proposals of community-based research to tackle the homelessness crisis and lack of housing affordability in the region of Waterloo. As part of this initiative, 2 projects will receive about $25,000 co-funded by the university and the region to support the work. We told you about the first in episode 144. Now, Brian Doucet, a professor in the School of Planning, is leading the second one. It's called Centering Lived Experiences in Solutions to the Homelessness Crisis, a Participatory Action Partnership. He tells us what that means and why it's important to involve people who have experience with homelessness themselves to help with the research. Thank you for being here, Brian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What interested you about studying homelessness in our community?
So I've studied housing issues for many years. When I moved to Waterloo back in 2017, I started studying a lot of the housing change that was taking place, particularly along the LRT corridor, a lot of the gentrification and the displacement. And what people were telling me at the time is, when this housing that's affordable to people on very low incomes is lost, either when it's demolished to make way for a new condo or when buildings are renovated, one of the outcomes for people is homelessness. It really connects with a lot of the work that I have been doing around housing and neighborhoods. Homelessness is the biggest challenge that the region is facing and that the most marginalized members of our community are facing. So it's been an issue for a long time, but in the last few years, it's become an even bigger issue that, of course, we can see visually when we're downtown and we see the encampment at Victoria and Weber, but there's far more to it than that. And of course, it's not something that happens in isolation. It's connected to all the other aspects of housing, of inequality, and so on.
Why does homelessness go hand in hand with gentrification?
Well, when neighborhoods upgrade, when neighborhoods improve, that's done through upgrading the housing stock. And there's a lot of older houses, in particular, in our own community, in and around downtown Kitchener, that over the years became rooming houses, right? Divided up into rooming houses, lots of people on very low incomes living there who had very few other options. So what's happening now is all this investment is coming into a space like downtown Kitchener, and more people want to live there, more people are choosing to live there. A lot of those rooming houses are being A, either demolished to make way for new condos, or B, being renovated and upgraded. And so what we're seeing is an erosion of housing that is affordable to people on low incomes. We're seeing a lot of new housing, right? You just go up and down the LRT corridor, between UW and all the way through the other side of downtown Kitchener. There's tons of construction cranes. Lots of new housing, net new housing being added. So the housing stock is growing, but we're not seeing the kind of housing stock added that is providing housing for those who were either displaced to make way for that housing or for other low-income individuals and households who need to find shelter. The developments taking place were not taking place on empty land. Sometimes there were parking lots, but sometimes there were communities and homes that existed there that have been displaced. And so, yes, thinking more proactively about the consequences of good transit, nobody was thinking about this really a decade or so, or very few people were thinking about this even internationally a decade or so ago. We considered this transit-oriented development to be an inherently good thing. And now we're starting to see, not just in Waterloo, but in other communities across Canada and other communities internationally, we're starting to look a little bit more critically at some of the impacts of this kind of way of growing our cities.
Can you help me understand, what does participatory action partnership mean specifically?
So the title of the project is called Centering Lived Experiences in Solutions to the Homeless Crisis, a Participatory Action Partnership. This is a project that really builds on collaboration that I've been involved with for several years now with the Social Development Centre of Waterloo Region. Social Development Centre is a non-profit advocacy group. They're part of the Social Planning Network of Ontario, so there's social planning councils and social planning organizations in communities all across the country. And they do a lot of social planning research. So they're not just advocates, but they actually do a lot of very creative, very important research, particularly with hard-to-reach communities. And we've been working together in the first case to try and understand what marginalized communities, low-income communities, are experiencing in terms of change along the LRT corridor. Now, the Social Development Centre has a really important working group that came out of some of the advocacy work around the City of Kitchener's affordable housing strategy. City of Kitchener's affordable housing strategy has a significant component that focuses on incorporating lived experiences of affected communities in shaping housing planning and policymaking. Now, that didn't come out of thin air. That was something that was being called for by many of us who were on the committee, myself, Alexandra Petrovich, who's the executive director of Social Development Centre, saying that if we're going to seriously address the structural issues with housing, we have to involve people who have the lived experience, the lived expertise in precarious housing, in being displaced, in struggling to find shelter, in experiencing homelessness. And you can't have an equitable or just housing policy when you only devise solutions that are then imposed on those communities. You need to involve those communities at all stages of the project. Participatory action research, it's a well-established research method. And it views participants as co-researchers. It emphasizes the active engagement of community members to produce knowledge that is of use to those communities. You have researchers with that lived experience. You train them to give them the necessary skills to help design the research. So what questions should we be asking people living in homeless encampments? I can think of questions as a housing researcher, but I know the best questions are going to come when we discuss those questions with people who also have that lived experience. And importantly, with this project, we are going to conduct a number of interviews with people living in homeless encampments throughout Waterloo Region. And the people doing those interviews are going to be people with that lived experience. We'll work together collaboratively, both academic researchers, lived experience researchers, and members of the Social Development Centre to analyze those results, to analyze those interviews, and to develop a series of recommendations. So we'll have, as I said, 3 or 4 members of that lived experience working group who will work closely with us on this project. And they'll come from a variety of different backgrounds. And in this kind of research, the more diverse the perspectives of the research team, the more diverse the results and the analysis and the findings are going to be. So having people with that kind of experience is going to be invaluable in helping to shape the way in which the project develops and the way in which we're able to connect with communities that are, by definition, very hard to reach. But this kind of research, I think, works best when you involve nonprofits, you involve community organizations who have connections with people on the ground, who have built up respect and trust. Social Development Centre has been around for a long time. They have done some fabulous work in our community, and they have built up a huge amount of trust and respect amongst some of the most marginalized individuals and groups within our community. Mm. And that kind of partnership and those kind of networks, I mean, someone from a local government can't really go in and do that. Even me as a critical housing researcher, very difficult for me to do the work that the Social Development Centre has done. And so partnering together, we're able to use our strengths to build something that's going to be greater than the sum of our parts. If I did this research individually, or if Social Development Centre did this research individually, it wouldn't come out as rich and as complex, good way, and detailed as if we're partnering together. And of course, we've built up this relationship over now several years.
What's involved in hiring somebody external to the university for this sort of work?
I think the most important thing, and this probably goes without saying, is you have to pay them. And you pay them a wage that reflects, what they're doing and their situations and their circumstances. So there's a minimum wage in Ontario, right? There's also a living wage, which is higher. And so for something like this, you have to pay a living wage. You have to pay people for their time. You have to compensate interviewees with a gift card or something. And when you're dealing with populations such as this, you tend to make those gift card values higher than, if you're just interviewing middle-class homeowners. I'd say there's a lot of just patience that you need when you're involving people who aren't studying, in this case, urban planning, which is what I teach, right? Who aren't thinking about these things all the time, who aren't using this position to get into grad school, right? And to get into their next thing. It requires, going over a lot of the basics. It requires just really working with people and listening. This partnership approach, this participant action approach, you have to recognize that everyone is bringing something to the table. And it's going to look different for each individual. But everyone's coming essentially as an equal partner, which is not always something that you come across in academic research. And I think those connections that people have within their communities, it's also a source of knowledge. They know what's happening to other people. And this is knowledge that policymakers rarely hear about. They also have connections with other people who probably want to share their story. They probably want to be heard. They're really happy to share their experiences, as painful and as difficult as they are, because nobody's listening. And one of the main reasons for doing this kind of research and this kind of approach is that we have so many perspectives on housing, so many perspectives on what's going on in our cities that are not prominent within mainstream debates that make and shape cities.
What kind of things are you hoping they'll tell you?
I think when you delve deeply into housing, especially when you take a critical look, it becomes quite clear fairly early on that we actually know a lot of the solutions that need to be done to fundamentally address the long-standing housing issues, particularly for low and very low-income communities. And it's not about building 1.5 million new houses. It's not about letting the market go wild with building what is most profitable to build. A lot of critical housing research focuses on things like building genuinely affordable housing, building supportive housing to get people off the streets, having things like strong rent control. So we talk so much in the mainstream housing debates about how do we build more housing? And we forget about the housing that is lost all the time, lower end of the market housing, through demolition, through renovations, a process sometimes called renoviction. When a tenant is evicted, the unit is renovated, the rents are raised because we have no end of tenancy rent control in Ontario. So if a unit is vacant, landlord can charge whatever they want. So the rent goes up and wealthier households move in. So we've done a lot of work in Waterloo interviewing people who have lived experience of displacement. We have another project with 4 of these social planning organizations across the province where we're looking at experiences of displacement in these communities across Ontario, urban and rural. And we hear the same stories. So the solutions are also known. If you want to prevent renovictions, you need strong anti-renoviction bylaws. New Westminster, British Columbia, actually has that. They introduced a bylaw a number of years ago that fines landlords a very heavy fine if they do not provide alternate accommodation, obviously not for free, right? But provide an alternate accommodation for tenants while their units are being renovated, because sometimes a tenant needs to vacate a unit if there's renovation going on and doesn't provide them the opportunity to return at the same rates that they were paying. that has brought rent evictions in New Westminster down to virtually nothing. I think equally important is, really centering the solutions, centering the ideas that people with lived experience have within how we plan our cities. So not just having some people with lived experience be part of an advisory committee and have nice words. Like, that's a very important start. But the next step is actually reshaping the decision-making table, right? Thinking about who's at that table. What role do they play? Who even decides who's at that table? What we're trying to do with this project is actually assemble the experiences, yes, very important, of living in encampments. How do people get there? What's life like in the encampments? But also what solutions people have, right? You ask a middle-class homeowner, what would improve your neighborhood? They could give you three or four or five different things. It's the same with everybody. Some will relate to the things in research around housing, like I've mentioned, right? Preventing homelessness, preventing evictions. There'll be lots of other things that I think we're going to hear about, and we'll hear, I think, many of the same stories from people. So we can, again, move beyond an individual anecdote and start to see bigger trends. So instead of saying, we've studied housing, we've got some recommendations that cities can do to help improve the situation by actually engaging meaningfully with people with lived experience of homelessness who are living in encampments, listening to what they're telling about how their situations can be improved. Then you flip those policy recommendations around, because then the policy recommendations come from those communities and cities, regions, the province, nonprofits. What can they do to support those ideas, support those initiatives that are developed on the ground up?
How do you get from the information gathering to actually creating a change, a positive change in some way?
That is a very good question. That's a very difficult question, because there aren't any easy answers. I mean, we have set ways of doing things with regard to housing that are very difficult to change. We have set ideas about different communities that are very difficult to change. It doesn't happen overnight. I think part of it is actually amplifying those perspectives, trying to use, as a housing researcher, as a Canada Research Chair, as an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, trying to use whatever power and privilege that I have to help bring some of those perspectives that are often completely absent from debates that are very central to the lives of those individuals, trying to bring those perspectives into a much more prominent and central position within those debates. So that is doing things, not just your conventional academic outputs, not only writing things that speak to my other housing researchers, that's doing things like going on the radio to talk about housing, to talk about the way in which housing in our society is both a commodity and a basic human right. And until we grapple with that, we're going to be in a perpetual state of crisis. I mean, that's not a perspective. It's a perspective you hear a lot about when you read critical housing research, by my national and international housing colleagues. But it's not a perspective you hear about so much in a mainstream format. That's an important step to shifting the political conversations, to shifting the planning and policy conversations that derive from it.
You did write a piece in The Conversation that got picked up. It was very popular, got picked up in other publications, and on that very topic, on housing as a basic human right. It's also a lucrative commodity, and that's something we need to remember and sort of find the balance. So, you know what? We're going to put a link to that in the show notes so that people can check that out as well.
Excellent. And, I study these kind of housing initiatives a lot. And the exciting thing is actually there are a lot of innovative examples also across the country. I mean, we often look to Europe and we look at what's Vienna doing? Well, to understand Vienna today, you've got to look at 100 years of Viennese and Austrian history to totally interpret that, right? And that's great for some inspiration, but there's also some really important examples across Canada that are going on at the moment. Some receive some attention for a little bit. Some are quite well known locally. But nationally, we don't necessarily have this picture of all these different examples that think beyond the market. So another report that I'm working on that should be released in the new year will try and just bring all these things together, try and sort of structure them, sort of conceptually think about what are different ways that we can think beyond the market in terms of shaping what the market builds, in terms of building housing without involving private developers, in terms of building new non-market housing, in terms of protecting the housing that's already affordable to people on low incomes, all sorts of really important examples that maybe we can't copy paste what Vancouver's doing, what New Westminster is doing, what Montreal's doing, but we can learn from it. And we can say, how can we take that idea and implement it in our own communities? We just sometimes can't conceive of doing things in a different way. You know, we've been tunnel vision for the last 30 years that the private sector is going to build the lion's share of housing. On top of that, about 30 years ago, we had the federal and provincial governments get out of the business of directly funding the construction of new affordable housing. So when we talk about a housing crisis in this country, if you're a low-income household, if you're on minimum wage, if you're on ODSP, if you're on Ontario Works, you've probably been in a housing crisis for decades. You know, there's this almost like new housing crisis. People who 5 or 10 years ago never would have dreamed that they'd be victims of a housing crisis are now struggling to afford housing in communities that they want to live in, right? If you're a teacher and a nurse, you know, forget about ever owning a home in and around Toronto, right? There's a genuine crisis, but it is in many ways different from someone who is on a waiting list with 80 or 90,000 other people for subsidized housing because they are on minimum wage. You know, they're a single mom with kids, which is the largest segment of the population that is in core housing need. Core housing need is when you pay more than 30% of your pre-tax income on housing. We talk about this as a housing crisis, but those are two very different interpretations of the housing crisis.
What's the timeline for the project?
We're going to start in the new year, and we're going to start first by finding people from the lived experience working group who would like to be part of this and who are able to be part of this. We'll hire a research assistant who will help with some of the literature, who will help and work closely with the lived experience researchers. And we'll start preparing things in the first few months of the new year. And then as springtime comes around, we'll start conducting interviews. And as I said, these interviews will all be conducted by people with lived experience, people from the lived experience working group. A population like this, you don't need hundreds and hundreds of interviews. We're aiming for about 20 or 25. And I think that will give us a very clear and detailed picture of the different experiences, but also the different solutions. And we'll work together as a team over the summer. We'll analyze those interviews. And we've got 3 things that we want to get out of this. We want to produce a report that will be very much focused on what those solutions are that people from these homeless encampments have. You know, what are they saying needs to be done? And the recommendations will be, well, how can different levels of government support that? Mm-hmm. What can they bring to the table to help make those solutions derived from the communities themselves? How can they make those happen? How can they enable? How can they support? What is necessary? And sometimes it might not be monetary. Sometimes it will be. Sometimes it might just be different aspects. Publicly owned land, for example. We'll also do an oral history project, which will focus on really the stories of these communities. And this is really important because if we're not documenting these communities tend to disappear. A lot of low-income communities, for example, in downtown Kitchener, are disappearing.
Where are they going?
Well, some of them are going into the homeless encampments. Some of the people that live in apartments that no longer exist or are no longer affordable. Your community is vanishing. Many of the buildings are still there, but the community around you is vanishing. And so if people aren't documenting these communities, they get erased. Work to preserve that memory, work to assemble that knowledge of that community. And that's a very important step in ensuring that future communities are not displaced and erased in the same way. Yeah, so we're aiming to have all this done next year.
Ryan Doucet, thank you so much for being here and sharing these insights today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. You'll find our archive of full episodes on the University of Waterloo website, and select interviews are on the university's YouTube channel. Just look for our playlist there. Please join Brandon, Sweet, and me for new episodes, and don't forget to tell your Waterloo connections about us.